They were traitors, troublemakers, and revolutionaries.
Do you know what it takes to found a country?
They've become icons, faces on our currency, images carved in marble and stone. But behind the labels and beneath the facades, they were more than heroes. They were human.
In another era, John Adams would have needed Prozac.
Hamilton had the first sex scandal.
The amount of alcohol was staggering. I don't know how they actually stood up.
These were the men who forged and fought for America's independence.
I believe that the Founding Fathers would be amazed that we have managed to survive, thrive for 200 years.
This is the story of our Founding Fathers. On the 7th of June, 1776, one bold proposal by congressional delegate Richard Henry Lee would awaken even the dozing Benjamin Franklin.
Resolved that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is, and ought to be, totally dissolved.
Lee was proposing treason. And even as late as 1776, not all of the American colonists were behind the idea of independence.
John Adams says later in life that the notion that the revolution had the support of the majority of the American people is probably not correct. That a third supported it, a third opposed it, and a third tried to sit in the middle and go with whichever force seemed to be present on the ground at that time.
Just 2 years earlier, Boston lawyer John Adams had believed in a moderate course of action. Now he was the champion of the radicals.
John Adams was one of the leaders of the Second Continental Congress. He was like a baseball player, in there day after day, pitching the ball, swinging the bat. He did not take recesses, and he stayed at his place and argued vociferously for his cause.
Surprisingly enough, among Adams's radical supporters were some members of the planter elite, the richest, most powerful men in the slave-owning southern colonies.
The planter elite was our aristocracy. They owed a lot of money to England all the time, and they were always in debt. So a revolution meant that they would not have to pay their debts to England, to the merchants in London. That was a very big factor.
One tall, red-headed member of the planter elite was fast becoming John Adams's staunchest supporter. His name was Thomas Jefferson. Like many of his neighbors, Jefferson did happen to be chronically in debt. But his motivations for the cause of independence ran as deep as his soul.
I like the dreams of the future better than the history of the past.
From the moment that Jefferson arrives in the Continental Congress, he's part of the radical side. And Adams loves him for this. This is the fundamental source of their bonding. At a moment when everything's up in the air, Jefferson is very clear that we are going to break free of the tyrannical rule of Great Britain. And he never backs off that. Jefferson believes the world is divided between the forces of light and the forces of darkness. And there's a dichotomous character to his mentality. Black, white, women, men, good, bad, light, darkness.
Although not all the members of Congress shared Jefferson's moral certainty, they appointed a 5-man committee headed by John Adams and Benjamin Franklin to draft a formal document outlining their ideals. John Adams later admitted that he fobbed the thankless writing task off on the 33-year-old Jefferson.
He doesn't have much to say in committee. He's not a very good debater. His voice does not project He's shy. One of the reasons that he's assigned the work of drafting documents is because that's the only role he can play. Jefferson has perfect pitch for language. He has a lyrical style.
In fact, Jefferson almost didn't make it back to Philadelphia in time to join the independence debate. Both his wife's difficult pregnancy and his mother's sudden death kept him in Virginia from December 1775 until May of 1776. Jefferson went to great lengths to ensure that posterity would know very little of his true feelings for the woman who raised him to become a proper Virginia gentleman. He burned all of their correspondence.
His father died when he was 14, and it was an event that was very, very important to him, and left him with his mother, with whom we don't think he had too great relations. He keeps his relationship with her quite secret. When he does refer to her, refers to her in a somewhat dismissive fashion.
What comes through to me in Jefferson in his youth is a kind of very sentimental guy, and also his attitude towards women is pretty misogynist. You can interpret that as a response to his mother.
Whatever he may have felt about Jane Randolph Jefferson, one thing is certain. Her death preceded one of the torturous headaches that plagued him throughout his life.
It seems reasonably clear that these things happen when he's under stress. When his mother dies, he has these headaches. When he arrives in Paris, he's got a migraine for almost a year. He comes back to the United States and into initially New York as Secretary of State. He gets a migraine right away. People back then had psychosomatic symptoms just like they do now.
Young Jefferson's headaches began while he was a student at William and Mary College after learning that his first love was going to marry another man. He recovered from both his heartache and his headache a few years later. That is, if one is to believe the recollections of Betsy Walker, the wife of a childhood friend. Walker told her husband that while he was away, young Jefferson made improper advances toward her, even accosting her in her bedchamber. When confronted 20 years later, Jefferson would respond more directly than some modern-day politicians faced with similar accusations.
When I was young and single, I offered my affections to a handsome lady. I acknowledge their incorrectness.
As a young man, he had a bit of the male coquette in him. He was somewhat on the prowl.
Jefferson's troubles with women seemed to be over by 1769 when he fell in love with Martha Wales Skelton, a beautiful, accomplished widow with whom he shared a passion for music. By most accounts, their union was a blissful one, though few details survive. The secretive Jefferson burned all of her letters as well. Fortunately for future generations, he was a vigilant archivist of his political writing. But even Jefferson's early handwritten drafts of the Declaration of Independence don't answer every question about its uneasy birth. One common accusation is that the document was not wholly original.
While it seems a little bit sacrilegious to say it, I think he pulls an all-nighter and he takes things from around him. Like he's got a copy of the draft of the Virginia Constitution, he's got copies of some of his old writings for the Continental Congress, and he puts them together in a kind of mad way. And then that document is brought before the full committee and debated. And about 25% of it is changed, deleted, revised, all during the time that the debate is occurring. It's Adams that's defending the draft. Jefferson says not a word. He is simmering. He is sullen. He resents this. They are lacerating my prose. The word then they use is mangled.
I was sitting by Dr. Franklin, who perceived that I was not insensible to these mutilations.
I have made it a rule whenever it is in my power to avoid becoming the draftsman of papers to be reviewed by a public body.
One of the many mutilations demanded by Congress was a passage in which Jefferson placed the blame for the North American slave trade squarely on the King of England.
It was as if George III had personally piloted the slave ships off to the coast of Africa, cracked the whip to get the slaves on boat, then turned westward, presided over the slave markets.
The Declaration of Independence was not Jefferson's first attempt to reconcile his conflicting views on slavery, nor would it be his last.
As a slave owner, he owns at any one time in his life about 200 slaves. He essentially describes himself as a patriarch, as a father, and these slaves are his children. This is a way of making himself, justifying in his own mind, the retention of African Americans as slaves, which at another level Jefferson believes to be fundamentally at odds with the American Revolution and with his own language in the Declaration of Independence. There's no question in his mind that slavery doesn't fit.
As early as 1774, Jefferson wrote,
"Slavery is an insult to the rights of human nature, deeply wounded by this infamous practice."
All the while knowing that without slaves, the South's booming economy would collapse. His lofty words never reflected his actions, and unlike his friend John Adams, he never took a strong public stand against the institution.
We have a lot of intellectual beliefs that we can't live up to in our personal lives. He was born into a slaveholding class. Slavery was a way of life from him from the very beginning to his death. He didn't have the discipline to move beyond that. There's an enormous amount of criticism of him for not living up to that ideal.
However he may have justified his own ambivalent views, privately, Jefferson dreaded history's judgment of slavery and its consequences to the future.
Indeed, I tremble for my country. When I reflect that God is just, His justice cannot sleep forever, a revolution of the wheel of fortune, an exchange of situation is among possible events. The Almighty has no attribute which can take sides with us in such a contest.
Congress soundly struck down Jefferson's attempted disavowal of slavery. After 4 days of debate, the dejected author went back to his rented rooms on Chestnut Street to rework his mangled prose.
He must have been unhappy. Afterwards, he copied out the entire document as the committee had reported it. 6 times, no less than 6 times, 6 copies of his versions of the Declaration have at least survived. And on each of these, he marked in the changes Congress made to show people how they had mutilated his text. It would take a tremendously injured man to go through that effort. It's a long document to write by hand.
Despite the committee's enforced changes, on the 2nd of July, Congress passed the Resolution for Independence. On the 4th of July, they approved the declaration of their newly claimed liberty.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed.
But as the delegates signed their names to America's first official document, they were all too aware of a terrifying fact.
From the moment you signed that, you were on a list somewhere. It was very, very possible that those men who now are the great icons would have been hunted down, convicted as traitors and of treason, and all executed.
An apocryphal exchange between John Hancock and Benjamin Franklin drove home that very point.
We must be unanimous. There must be no pulling different ways. We must all hang together.
Yes, we must indeed all hang together. Most assuredly, we will all hang separately.
In July of 1776, George Washington had better things to do than to argue the arcane points of Thomas Jefferson's prose. After ordering that the Declaration of Independence be read aloud to his troops, he set off to command at one of the most humiliating defeats in American history. With only a ragtag army and no navy whatsoever, he planned to defend the islands of New York against the greatest naval power in the world.
It's an impossible assignment, and he couldn't do it. And he lost one battle after another, a whole series of engagements.
The greatest disaster of all at Fort Washington is this indefensible place in Manhattan that could easily be surrounded on three sides. It would have been a sound plan if Washington had choppers to take the troops out, but he didn't, and they lost a third of their army.
Washington had been head of the army for more than a year. He had checkmated the British out of Boston. But up until New York, he hadn't fought an actual battle. The future of the American cause looked grim.
Till of late, I had no doubt in my own mind of defending this place. But this I despair of. It is painful and extremely grating to me to give such unfavorable accounts, but it would be still more criminal to conceal the truth at so critical a juncture.
After Washington's New York debacle, the British sent discreet word to Congress that they'd be willing to discuss a peace settlement. A delegation led by John Adams and Benjamin Franklin set out for British headquarters on Staten Island to attempt a negotiation. On their way to the rendezvous, the statesmen found there was literally no room at the inn. Adams and Franklin had to share a small chamber and a bed. They made very strange bedfellows.
Franklin and Adams seem like oil and water. Franklin had his theories of keeping the windows wide open because he thought this was very healthy. Adams, on the other hand, wanted the windows closed.
Oh, don't shut the windows. We shall be suffocated.
The doctor then began a harangue upon air and cold and respiration and perspiration, with which I was so much amused that I soon fell asleep and left him and his philosophy together.
Franklin had the opposite personality of Adams. Franklin never rubbed people the wrong way. Everybody adored him.
John Adams was not a popular guy. He was not the kind of fellow that everybody wanted to go out and drink with after a session of Congress. On occasion, he would say to Abigail or in his diary, "People don't like me. I'm not charming. I don't have any real appeal to other people." And he couldn't understand why, because he was always right.
For Adams, his favorite form of a conversation is an argument. Jefferson describes a meeting in which Adams jumps on the table and flings his wig at people because they aren't doing what he says. So he's a man capable of outbursts.
John Adams was impressively cool on September 9th, 1776, when he and his comrades joined British Commander-in-Chief General William Howe at his headquarters on Staten Island. Howe greeted the Patriots cordially, enticing them with bread, mutton, and an excellent claret. But the meeting was fraught with hostile undertones. At one point, General Howe lamented how personally painful it would be for him to have to ravage and destroy America. Ben Franklin smiled and replied simply,
"My lord, we will use our utmost endeavors to save your lordship that mortification."
By the end of the evening, the peace talks had collapsed. Victory or defeat still remained in George Washington's hands. But by December of 1776, those hands were full of problems. Most of his 3,400-man army had only enlisted until New Year's Eve. By December 31st, the Continental Army would cease to exist. The commander-in-chief despaired openly in a letter to his cousin.
Your imagination can scarce extend to a situation more distressing than mine. Our only dependence now is upon the speedy enlistment of a new army. If this fails, I think the game will be pretty well up.
On the night of December 19th, 1776, George Washington had only 12 days left to produce a miracle.
It is fearfully cold and raw, and a snowstorm is setting in. The wind is northeast and beats in the faces of the men. It will be a terrible night for the soldiers who have no shoes. Some of them have old rags tied round their feet. You might have tracked the army from White Marsh to Valley Forge by the blood of their feet.
In the winter of 1776, a former British immigrant turned American officer slogged through the slush and mud of New Jersey in yet another humiliating retreat. All around him, Thomas Paine heard the grumblings of his fellow soldiers, only taking comfort in the fact that they would be soon going home to their families. Their commitment to Washington's army would be finished on December 31st, and it was clear to Paine that they had had enough. Just 5 months after the American rebels declared independence, their cause seemed doomed. But this brilliant propagandist, author of the pamphlet Common Sense that had inspired the revolution, was not ready to give up the fight.
Paine was with the American Army at the end of 1776, which was probably its nadir, one of its grimmest times. And he was seeing it at its worst point, at its most depressed point. And this led Paine to write what I think is his greatest effort, which was the first issue of the American Crisis.
These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman.
It was winter. They wanted to go home. It was cold. They hadn't been paid. So Washington did two things. He got a loan from his banker friend Robert Morris in Philadelphia, and he also had the American Crisis read to his troops. It's one of the great command performances in all political writing, or all writing, really.
What we obtain too cheap, we esteem too lightly. It is dearness only that gives everything its value. Heaven knows how to put a proper price upon its goods, and it will be strange indeed if so celestial an article as freedom should not be highly rated.
Inspired by these words and a personal plea from Washington himself, most American soldiers made the courageous decision to stay. With his army resurrected, the general planned an outrageous move. He would attack the enemy post at Trenton, New Jersey, a stronghold guarded by 1,358 Hessian mercenaries, early on December 26th, the day after Christmas.
The Hessians were partying all night, and they were in drunken stupors when Washington crossed the Delaware and marched down to Trenton and defeated the Hessians. So that was his big battle.
On January 3rd, 1777, Washington gave his country a New Year's present of a second victory at Princeton, New Jersey. Overnight, he became the colony's first media superhero. Washington's own rising star made him more prone to complain about his mixed, motley crew of soldiers.
In a word, I believe I may with truth add that I do not think any officer since the creation ever had such a variety of difficulties and perplexities to encounter as I have.
The general was especially hard on his aides de camp, more aptly described as his steno pool. Washington was known for keeping 5 men working round the clock on his correspondence alone.
All Washington was doing is sending all these letters to Congress. We don't have enough guns. We don't have enough tents. We don't have enough blankets. Letter after letter. That was his real war.
Good secretarial help was hard to find, until, while fighting at Trenton and Princeton, Washington happened upon a very young, very brilliant artillery officer. A fellow soldier described 19-year-old Alexander Hamilton.
A youth, a mere stripling, small, slender, almost delicate in frame, marching beside a piece of artillery with a cocked hat pulled down over his eyes, apparently lost in thought, with his hand resting on the cannon and every now and then patting it as he mused, as if it were a favorite horse or a pet plaything.
Washington would have 32 different aides-de-camp during the course of the Revolution, but none would mean more to the general or the country than would Alexander Hamilton. In the meantime, the battles at Trenton and Princeton would be the last victories either one of them would see for several years to come. In 1776, just as today, success was often as much a matter of who you know as what you know. When the American Revolution began, 19-year-old artillery captain Alexander Hamilton had both ends of the equation covered. He was ambitious, he made the right connections, and, to top it off, he was a genius.
Hamilton knows nothing about the military, goes and checks out 2 books on artillery, decides he can do this, goes right into the war. Well, he attracts the attention of George Washington, and this makes his fortune, this makes his future, because Hamilton is invited by Washington to join what Washington calls his family, which means his aide-de-camps around him. Then really immediately Washington takes him on as a son.
Alexander Hamilton came from further back and from worse circumstances than any of the other founding fathers.
Alexander Hamilton really is rags to riches story. If you want the quintessential self-made man, this is your guy.
Born on St. Croix, then the Dutch West Indies, Hamilton was the illegitimate son of a Scottish merchant and a married storekeeper. Hamilton himself described his birth as one
not free from blemish.
In later years, John Adams would be a bit more blunt, calling him
the bastard brat of a Scotch peddler.
James Hamilton abandoned his family when Alexander was 9 years old, and his mother died when he was 11. So at the age of 11, he was a poor, illegitimate orphan living in the Virgin Islands.
He should have wound up an obscure figure on an obscure island, never heard from again, except for one small factor, and that is that he was a genius. He had an extraordinary mind, and an extraordinary practical mind, that is a mind for business and economics. And it was recognized very quickly. By the time he's 11 or 12, he is working in a merchant's office. And by the time he's 13 and 14, the man who owns this international shipping business has gone off to England and left Hamilton in charge of the entire operation.
But the enterprising Hamilton had dreams that reached far beyond a desk job on an obscure island.
To confess my weakness, my ambition is so prevalent that I contemn the groveling condition of a clerk, or the like to which my fortune condemns me, and would willingly risk my life, though not my character, to exalt my station. I shall conclude saying, I wish there was a war.
Hamilton would get his wish, but not for a few more years. In the meantime, he attracted the attention of some powerful men on the island, who sent him to America to continue his education.
By 15 and a half, they sent him off to the College of New Jersey, which becomes Princeton. And he has the nerve to say, this is not a guy who lacks self-confidence, not only do I want to be admitted to the college, but I want to be admitted with advanced standing. They say no. He says, fine, I'll go to King's College. He was incredibly impatient, so that a few years later, when he decides he wants to be a lawyer, and they tell him, well, it will take 3 years of apprenticeship, he says, don't be silly. He says, give me the books. And in about a year, he's ready to go in and pass the bar.
In later years, Hamilton's arrogance would earn him as many enemies as opportunities. Thomas Jefferson believed
Hamilton's career is a tissue of machinations against the liberty of his country.
John Adams called Hamilton
the little man,
despite the fact that Hamilton was 3 inches taller than Adams. But there was one man whose opinion outweighed all others, and George Washington believed in Alexander Hamilton.
By some, he is considered as an ambitious man, and therefore a dangerous one. That he is ambitious, I shall readily grant, but it is of the laudable kind, which prompts a man to excel in whatever he takes in hand. He is enterprising, quick in his perceptions, and his judgment intuitively great.
Washington admired all of Hamilton's quick intelligence. Washington was not a man of quick intelligence. This is not to say he was stupid, but his mind didn't process in the same way that Hamilton's did, and he admired that. On the other hand, Hamilton learned a lot from Washington. He learned how to comport himself in particular situations. So there was a mutual learning between these two men. I'm inclined to think, though this is an interpretation, that there was a great deal more genuine affection from Washington's side, based possibly on a neediness for a son, than on Hamilton's side.
The two men shared many interests beyond the art of war, not the least of which was flirting with beautiful women. Washington was a legendary dancer. Ladies tore up their dance cards for a chance to minuet the night away with the statuesque general. Hamilton's eye for the ladies would cause him trouble throughout his life. He jokingly dictated an 18th century version of a personal ad for a wife.
I lay most stress upon a good shape. A little learning will do. As to fortune, the larger stock of that, the better. If she happens to be a virgin, I'm willing to take the trouble of that upon myself.
Not surprisingly, the resourceful Hamilton found a wife without the personals.
Hamilton aims high. He marries General Schuyler's daughter. General Schuyler, one of the biggest landowners, the creme de la creme of New York society.
While Washington, Hamilton, and the rest of the American army struggled on the battlefields of North America, on the other side of the Atlantic, a diplomatic war was just beginning. As newly appointed emissary to France, Benjamin Franklin's mission was to gain financial and military support for the American cause. The outcome of the revolution would depend on his success. In the fall of 1776, 70-year-old Benjamin Franklin, the eldest delegate to the Continental Congress, once again prepared to cross the Atlantic, this time with a heavy heart. A few months earlier, his only surviving son, William, royal governor of New Jersey, had been arrested and made a political prisoner of the Patriots for conspiring to help the British cause. Franklin promptly cut William off without a word.
Franklin, throughout his life, had emphasized the importance of the fifth commandment, honor thy father and thy mother, and to have his son disobey his requests on this important issue broke his heart.
Dear son, indeed nothing has ever hurt me so much and affected me with such keen sensations as to find myself deserted in my old age by my only son. And not only deserted, but to find him taking up arms against me in a cause wherein my good fame, fortune, and life were all at stake.
The break was bitter, and the break was final. They spoke once again in their lives, and it was not all that warm.
But some people say that this is one of Franklin's greatest flaws, that he couldn't overcome politics to say of a son, I don't approve of what you do, but you are my son and will always be my son. That was really quite sad.
Benjamin Franklin had other problems on his mind as he sighted the French coastline in late November 1776. His mission was a nearly impossible one, to convince one king, Louis XVI, to help topple another.
He's coming from a republic, new nation on a new model that's already decided that getting rid of kings is the thing to do. Franklin goes to the heart of the most autocratic French regime and asks for support for the American king busters, if you will.
From the moment he stepped onto the pier at Auray, the French accorded Franklin celebrity status. Recalling the famous revolutionary's experiments with electricity, they called him
the man who ripped the lightning from the skies and the scepter from the tyrant.
His image was set in the lids of snuff boxes and on the faces of rings. It even became an instant Parisian fashion to hang an engraving of Franklin above the mantelpiece.
French society opened its arms to Franklin the way it has never done to any other foreigner since then.
John Adams, who would soon join Franklin in Paris, burned with envy over Franklin's unmatched popularity.
His name was familiar to government and people, to kings, courtiers, nobility, clergy, and philosopher. There was scarcely a peasant or a citizen, a valet de chambre, coachman or footman, lady's chambermaid, or scullion in a kitchen who was not familiar with and who did not consider him a friend to humankind. When they spoke of him, they seemed to think he was to restore the golden age. His plans and his example were to abolish monarchy, aristocracy, and hierarchy throughout the world.
Adams just did not approve of Franklin's life in France. It was not his style. He thought that Franklin socialized far too much with women. He thought that some of Franklin's behavior was scandalous.
The puritanical Adams disapproved of all of Franklin's decidedly non-puritanical ways. Franklin, he said,
at the age of 70-odd, has neither lost his love of beauty nor his taste for it.
In a letter to a step-niece, Franklin defended his behavior.
You mentioned the kindness of the French ladies to me. I must explain that matter. This is the civilest nation upon earth. Your first acquaintances endeavor to find out what you like, and they tell others. If 'tis understood that you like mutton, dine where you will, you find mutton. Somebody, it seems, gave it out that I loved ladies.
John Adams looks at what Franklin's doing. See, he stays up all night long. He socializes all the time. Has that man no shame? Doesn't he go to bed at a decent hour? Oh, and Abigail spots him one day sitting on a sofa with a French woman showing a little bit too much leg. What's Franklin doing? He's being diplomatic. And in Paris, he's flattering every important lady he sees. Anyone who has the ear of the king, he is flattering.
His skill at flattery, however, did not guarantee him success with the king. Louis XVI had no intention of backing a loser, and by the end of 1777, American Commander-in-Chief George Washington hadn't won a battle in nearly a year.
He was not a natural military genius. He wasn't an Alexander or a Caesar. But of course, Alexander and Caesar had an excellent army to work with from day one. Washington had nothing. He had militias, mostly totally inexperienced farmers. He had to build his army from scratch.
And then his troops were often running away from the battles and followed by Washington, come back, come back. Now, this confounded the British because they fought wars in the grand continental manner. When you lost the battle, you surrendered, but the Americans would never surrender.
Finally, late on the morning of December 4th, 1777, some thrilling news reached Benjamin Franklin in Paris. The British Army at Saratoga had surrendered to the Americans. Franklin heaved a sigh of relief as France finally agreed to a desperately needed military alliance with the United States of America. 5 years later, he would write proudly of his ambassadorship, referring to himself in the third person.
Though he has always been an active man, he never went through so much business in 8 years in any part of his life as during those of his residence in France, which, however, he did not decline till he saw peace happily made and found himself in the 80th year of his age, when, if ever, a man has some right to expect repose.
Across the Atlantic, however, repose was still years away for one beleaguered American general.
A common criticism of Washington's generalship is that he lost more battles than he won. And it's true, but war is not the World Series. It's not the best out of 7. What's important is who wins the last battle.
For General George Washington, that last battle would finally arrive in September 1781 at Yorktown, the decisive moment of the Revolutionary War.
Washington marched his troops to Yorktown, and in a miracle, the French fleet actually arrived at the same time as the Americans did, and the French were very unpredictable. The storms would hit them, and they would get maybe just a yearning for French cooking, and they would just pack up and leave and abandon everything. But everything came together at Yorktown.
At this hilly outpost on the Virginia coast, the combined Franco-American alliance paid off with a vengeance. British Lord Cornwallis humbly surrendered his army to General George Washington. The American War for Independence was over. They were traitors, troublemakers, and revolutionaries.
Do you know what it takes to found a country?
They've become icons, faces on our currency, images carved in marble and stone. But behind the labels and beneath the facades, they were more than heroes. They were human.
In another era, John Adams would have needed Prozac.
Hamilton had the first sex scandal.
The amount of alcohol was staggering. I don't know how they actually stood up.
These were the men who forged and fought for America's independence.
I believe that the Founding Fathers would be amazed that we have managed to survive, thrive for 200 years.
This is the story of our Founding Fathers. Yorktown, October 1781. Though the last drops of British and American blood had yet to be shed, the long prologue to American history was essentially over.
The Americans win. And now it's the morning after, and you realize, 13 colonies on the edge of what they considered to be a wilderness, broke, no money, no blueprint. We can't go and look in the book and say, now how did another country do this? It must have been terrifying to suddenly realize now you've got to actually make this work.
For the first time in over 8 years, the newly independent Americans would have to make their fledgling nation work without the comforting presence of their national hero, George Washington.
When Washington went away to the Second Continental Congress, he told Martha he'd be home by Christmas. He didn't tell her which Christmas he'd be home by.
At Fraunces Tavern in Manhattan, Washington hosted a farewell dinner for his officers. His intelligence chief, Colonel Benjamin Talmadge, chronicled the emotional event.
We had been assembled but a few minutes when His Excellency entered the room. His emotions, too strong to be concealed, seemed to be reciprocated by every officer present. Turning to the officers, he said,
"With a heart full of love and gratitude, I now take leave of you."
Such a scene of sorrow and weeping I had never before witnessed, and hope I may never be called upon to witness again.
On December 23, 1783, the general tendered his official resignation before Congress. His hands shook as he pulled his farewell speech from his pocket.
I consider it an indispensable duty to close this last solemn act of my official life by commending the interest of our dearest country to the protection of Almighty God.
The newly retired commander-in-chief mounted his horse and rode the 50 miles to Mount Vernon. This year, at least, he would be home for Christmas. Without the 6'4" icon at their helm, the Founding Fathers gradually lapsed into a state of post-war apathy. It was difficult to get a quorum in Congress, even to approve the peace treaty with England. Another important leadership figure was absent during most of these sessions. Thomas Jefferson, often torn between his public and private life, was frequently returning to Monticello to tend to his delicate wife, Martha. By 1782, Martha herself knew she was dying.
There's an account among the slaves that he made a promise to his wife that he would not marry again, and that story was repeated by one of his overseers who had evidently heard this. And her reason was not so much that she didn't want him to have anyone else, is that she did not want another woman over her children.
For 6 weeks following his wife's death, Thomas Jefferson sobbed uncontrollably through the night and whenever he tried to speak of her.
He was absolutely inconsolable at that time, and at one point wrote several months after that to one of his sisters that were it not for his children, he would not think of continuing to live.
Jefferson's 10-year-old daughter Patsy became his constant companion. Despite their closeness, her father was a master of what a 20th century psychologist might call conditional love.
Take care that you never spell a word wrong. No distress which this world can now bring on me could equal that of your disappointing my hopes. If you love me then, strive to be good under every situation.
In 1784, Jefferson took Patsy with him to Paris, where his peers had appointed him minister to the French court, replacing the popular Benjamin Franklin.
He settled in Paris and had what was one of the probably great moments of his life, that is his relationship with Maria Causeway, a vivacious, sparkling miniaturist. That is, she painted miniature portraits. It seems to have been the great love of Jefferson's life. It was an impossible relationship.
The beautiful Italian-born Maria happened to be married to a chronically unfaithful British painter, Richard Cosway. That fact, however, did not deter Jefferson in his pursuit.
He likes married women. Jefferson is a kind of male coquette she herself is coquettish and is a slayer, according to everybody's testimony. But in the case of Jefferson, she meets her match.
It was to impress Mrs. Cosway that Jefferson gallantly vaulted over a fence and fell, breaking the wrist of the hand that penned the Declaration of Independence. The injury would plague him for the rest of his life. Shortly afterward, the lovers were parted when Maria was forced to return to England with her husband. Despite his wrist injury, Thomas wrote her a 12-page, 4,000-word declaration of his passion, entitled A Dialogue Between the Head and the Heart.
I am indeed the most wretched of all earthly beings, overwhelmed with grief, every fiber of my frame distended beyond its natural powers to bear. I feel more fit for death than life. But when I look back on the pleasures of which it is the consequence, I am conscious they were worth the price I am paying. Hope is sweeter than despair.
Despite Jefferson's tender sentiments, he and Mrs. Cosway would never again be alone together.
It is also highly possible, we don't know for sure yet, that it is during the latter stages of his parish years that Jefferson begins a sexual relationship with Sally Hemings.
Known as Dashing Sally at Monticello, 14-year-old slave Sally Hemings arrived in Paris in 1787 as a traveling companion for Jefferson's younger daughter, Polly. The Monticello staff described the handsome Sally as mighty near white. The truth was, Sally's mother had been the mistress of Jefferson's own father-in-law. Sally came to Monticello as Martha Jefferson's property, but also as her illegitimate half-sister.
Slavery wasn't just a system where people worked and didn't get paid. It was a social system. There was interaction between people, and miscegenation, race mixing, was a feature of slavery that was not uncommon. It was not favored, but people were left alone as long as they didn't flaunt their relationships.
A uniquely shaped Y chromosome shared by Jefferson and some Hemings descendants reveals another side of the man behind the implacable mask of Thomas Jefferson.
In Paris, my mother became Mr. Jefferson's concubine, and when he was called to return home, she was with child by him. He desired to bring my mother back to Virginia, but she demurred. In France, she was free, while if she returned to Virginia, she would be re-enslaved.
Jefferson promised her that if she returned with him, that he would give her children freedom when they became adults, and that she would live a life of privilege, which is what happened.
According to Sally's son, Madison, 4 Hemings Jefferson children survived to adulthood. All were free by their 21st birthdays. 2 of them passed themselves off as white and married into white families. Because Thomas Jefferson burned so many of his personal papers and letters, he took most of his secrets with him to the grave. What has emerged from the myriad clues he did leave behind is a portrait of a complex, brilliant, thoroughly human leader.
This is a human being, flesh and blood, like all of us, a very talented one, so it makes his accomplishments that much more great, and perhaps his weaknesses somewhat more annoying to us, but it puts him in perspective, and it makes history live, I think, and makes it alive in a way that Plaster Saints can't.
In the late 1780s, all the Founding Fathers would make history once again, struggling with decisions that would create the first republic since Rome or doom it to failure. From his seat of retirement at Mount Vernon, George Washington waxed pessimistic about America's future.
The United States exhibit a melancholy proof of what our transatlantic foe have predicted, that mankind, when left to themselves, are unfit for their own government.
His gloom proved well-founded when in 1786 a violent anti-tax rebellion raged out of control in Massachusetts. It looked as if the great American experiment was doomed to end in anarchy.
The founding fathers were all history buffs, and the history they studied taught them that no republic had ever survived, that always a tyrant arose, or a king was chosen, or they were conquered by someone. And I'm sure that there must have been many an evening when they thought, maybe we should go back, maybe we should give the king a little call and see if he'd like to come back.
Since 1781, the United States as a whole had been run by the Continental Congress, based on a duly ratified agreement among the states called the Articles of Confederation. It may have sufficed in wartime, with every colony united against a common enemy, but once the cannon smoke lifted, its weaknesses seemed glaring.
The Confederation was, as its name suggests, this collection of state governments. State governments were the key. If a state government didn't want to cooperate in some scheme of the national legislature, it just said no. Any change had to be unanimous, which was this enormous problem throughout the 1780s. It was this feeble, inefficient government.
Always intolerant of inefficiency, Alexander Hamilton was furious when only 12 delegates showed up at the first meeting called to solve this problem.
Hamilton had a vision that this country could be the richest, most powerful, most influential country in the world, and the Articles of Confederation wasn't part of it.
Take into consideration the situation of the United States, to devise such further provisions as shall appear to them necessary to render the Constitution of the federal government adequate to solve the current crisis.
Every state but Rhode Island responded to Hamilton's summons to the first Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787.
The delegates to the Constitutional Convention saw themselves as having a very great charge. Basically, they were saving the Revolution.
One delegate, a Virginia planter named James Madison, arrived at the convention 11 days early. He came armed with a complete plan for a new government, based not on the states as independent governments, but on the people as a whole. Madison had been doing his homework.
The union of so many states is, in the eyes of the world, a wonder.
If there's someone in America today who reminds me a little bit of Madison, it's Bill Gates, this nerdy, awkward guy who really found this field in which he could excel. James Madison, this shy, studious, awkward man, became the father of the Constitution.
James Madison was the eldest child of one of Virginia's most prominent families. A frail, sickly boy, he immersed himself in the world of the mind. By the age of 9, he was devouring the books in his father's library. By 11, he could read French, Latin, and Greek.
If I would say who's going to get the highest grades on the SATs, I think it's probably Alexander Hamilton. But Madison's right up there.
He was 5.5 feet tall, slight of build. He suffered from these nervous fits, and no one's been able to figure out exactly what he suffered from. It seemed that he was just this intense, nervous sort who was subject to these anxiety attacks.
When he came back from the College of New Jersey in the early 1770s, he doesn't have any firm sense of where he's going in life.
As for myself, I am too dull and infirm now to look out for any extraordinary things in this world.
I've always thought that Madison was the kind of guy who the revolution came along. It really gave him a sense of purpose. Madison's sense of who he was and what he wanted for the country was very much defined in the crucible of revolution.
The 18th century equivalent of 4F, Madison decided that if he couldn't fight on the battlefield, he'd do it in the legislature. At the age of 25, he threw himself into politics, becoming one of the youngest men to attend the Virginia Constitutional Convention. There, in 1776, he met the man who would change his life as well as his politics, then Governor Thomas Jefferson.
The friendship between Madison and Jefferson is probably one of the most important and consequential political alliances in American history. He becomes Jefferson's protege, and Jefferson likes to cultivate acolytes. He likes to have an entourage.
His friendship with Jefferson helped speed Madison along the fast track to the top of the revolutionary elite. In 1780, he was elected to the Second Continental Congress, and through the years of the Revolution, blossomed into a single-minded and effective politician. But while his professional fame began to spread, society gossips pegged him a bachelor for life. It wouldn't be until 1794 that the voluptuous Dolly Payne Todd, the most sought-after widow in Philadelphia, would write excitedly to her best friend.
Aaron Burr says that the great little Madison has asked to be brought to see me this evening.
Whatever happened that night, it's clear that the chemistry between the diminutive congressman and the 18th century bombshell was instant and mutual.
Looking at Dolly, you can't imagine a stronger contrast. You have Madison, this bookish, serious statesman, and you have Dolly, who loved to entertain and socialize. And she provided this important counterpoint to him. Where he was cold, she was warm. Where he was quiet, she was sociable. And she became very quickly this prominent person on the national political social scene.
The colorful Dolly Payne Todd was still 7 years in his future, the day Madison arrived at the Constitutional Convention, dressed in his customary black. In a hot room in Philadelphia, flies buzzed around the heads of 55 unpredictable men who, in the coming weeks, had the daunting task of fashioning a new government from the ground up. On May 9, 1787, George Washington once again descended from Mount Vernon to do his public duty, this time as President of America's Constitutional Convention. The new nation would sink or swim on the outcome of this gathering.
We now have a national character to establish, and must form a constitution that will give consistency, stability, and dignity to the Union.
Washington was a figurehead at the Constitutional Convention. If he was there, then the convention was kosher, everything was going to be okay because Washington was the good guy.
When you look at the personalities who were there, and you start to recognize different types, different positions. Washington and Franklin. They're committed nationalists, and they're both there primarily for kind of dignity, for charisma, and I think also, perhaps more important, to kind of brace up the other delegates.
Many of the Revolution's foremost personalities were absent from the convention. John Hancock was too busy with his new post as governor of Massachusetts. Samuel Adams also remained in Boston. Thomas Jefferson was still an ocean away as ambassador to France. John Adams had taken a similar post in England, and Patrick Henry bluntly refused Virginia's nomination.
I smelt a rat!
Controversy swirled around the yet unwritten Constitution even before the conference began. But it was one small man in that room full of tension who spoke with the confidence of a prepared and thoughtful statesman.
Literally in the 2 months before the convention, Madison sets himself a kind of course of reading all the kind of great works of ancient and modern confederacies. He was a kind of politician who understood that most politicians are not going to be as well prepared as you are. Then you'll really be in a good position, if not to control the outcome of debate, at least to set the agenda.
He arrived with what would later be called the Virginia Plan in hand, and it was the framework from which all of these great men worked that summer. And without it, it's hard to imagine we would have the sort of government we do today.
If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, Neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself.
What Madison and Virginia plan to do is they say we have to essentially start from scratch. Starting from scratch means we need a whole government. We can't just give a few extra powers to Congress. It has to be able to enact its own laws, to execute its own laws, and to adjudicate its own laws.
Over the 7 weeks of debates, the impassioned delegates wrangled over everything we still argue about today: states' rights versus federal power, and the limits of executive authority. On that issue, Alexander Hamilton shook the House with a radical proposal.
As to the executive, it seems that no good one can be established on Republican principles. The English model is the only good one on this subject. Let one branch of the legislature hold their places for life, or at least during good behavior. Let the executive also be for life.
The delegates sat in stunned silence. Was the Caribbean immigrant actually suggesting a government with a king, based on the British system that they had so recently overthrown?
One of the raps against Hamilton is that he was a hidden monarchist. He was for a strong central government, that's true, but he never wanted an American monarchy. He feared that we might have to have one if our current government collapsed, and he wasn't hopeful about its strength. But he said the Republican experiment is the one we've embarked upon, and we have to give it a fair trial.
As the weeks wore on, the delegates seemed deadlocked. Elder statesman Benjamin Franklin became the voice of reason.
When you assemble a number of men to have the advantage of their joint wisdom, you inevitably assemble with those men all their prejudices, their passions, their errors of opinions, and their selfish views. Thus, I consent to this Constitution, because I expect no better, and because I am not sure that it is not the best.
On September 17th, the final draft was presented to the convention delegates.
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America.
As the last members were signing, Benjamin Franklin observed an image of the sun carved on the back of the president's chair.
I have often, in the course of the session, looked at that behind the president without being able to tell whether it was rising or setting. But now at length I have the happiness to know that it is a rising and not a setting sun.
It would be many more months before the dawn itself would break. The Constitution, approved by the delegates, still needed to be ratified by 9 out of 13 very divided states. From his country seat in Pleasant Grove, Virginia, veteran orator Patrick Henry raged against the Constitution, even before he'd finished reading it. From September of 1787 through the winter of the following year, the former Voice of Thunder emerged as the most fervent leader of the Anti-Federalists, those opposed to ratifying the new document.
The simplest way to understand it is that Anti-Federalists argued that if the Constitution was adopted, the state governments would simply wither away.
That this is a consolidated government is strikingly clear. And the danger of such a government is very striking. Who authorized them to speak the language of we the people instead of we the states?
Henry felt that the central government threatened the liberty of the people
Most importantly, he felt that it absolutely had to have a Bill of Rights that protected the freedoms and liberties of people.
The rights of conscience, trial by jury, liberty of the press, all your immunities and franchises. Will the abandonment of your most sacred rights tend to the security of your liberty?
Henry is so upset by the Constitution, he can't control himself. He's making so many charges, and some of them are so wild, and he's ranging so back and forth that in effect he kind of dissipates the anti-federalist energy, and he makes it easier for the other Federalist speakers to kind of come back and hit him, point after point after point.
Meanwhile, the Federalist faction, led by Madison in Virginia and Alexander Hamilton in New York, had been waging a much quieter campaign with a series of essays. The Federalist Papers clearly and calmly explained the Constitution's goals.
Hearken not to the voice which petulantly tells you that the form of government recommended for your adoption is a novelty in the political world. What are we to say to the men who profess the most flaming zeal for republican government, yet boldly impeach the fundamental principle of it?
The Federalist position is we need to have a strong national government. There are some objects of national policy we just need. We can't get by without them.
After many bitter debates, the Federalists prevailed. On June 21, 1788, New Hampshire became the 9th state to ratify the document, making it official. The first job of the infant republic was to elect its first leader, a new president for a new nation.
Well, Washington was unanimously elected, and a lot of these people had opposed the Constitution. They were anti-Federalists, and yet they all voted for George Washington. No one had a thought that anyone else could possibly have this job. So he had the easiest election experience that there has ever been or ever will be.
There were many elements in society that wanted to call the leader of the country the king. But once again, George Washington's keen political sense told him there was something wrong with his being called King George the First, since they had spent 8 years overthrowing a King George.
President-elect Washington was probably the unhappiest man at his own inauguration. Leaving Mount Vernon to move to New York, the nation's temporary capital, Washington wrote an old friend.
My movements to the chair of government will be accompanied by feelings not unlike those of a culprit going to his place of execution.
The names of Washington's cabinet read like a political dream team. Vice President, John Adams. Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson. But rifts were already forming between the former revolutionary comrades.
They immediately hardened their opinions into parties, so much so that today we buy into the notion that the two-party system is part of the American Constitution. It's nothing of the sort. The political fights of the period are filthy.
When it came time to run for a second term, Washington just wanted to go home. Only his fear that a bitter feud between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson would tear the new country apart convinced him to remain in office for one more term.
Washington, after the second administration, retired from office. If it wasn't for Washington, we would be like a banana republic in Central America. Every few years, a new group of young colonels with a Washington figure would sweep into power. But Washington, he could have been a Caesar. He had so much power, and he actually gave it up. This is why he was a great man.
Among his surviving papers, a single letter bears evidence that even after winning a war and running a country, the 65-year-old Washington was still haunted by his first love, Sally Fairfax.
During this period, many events have occurred and such changes in men and things have taken place, none of which events, however, nor all of them together, have been able to eradicate from my mind the recollection of those happy moments, the happiest in my life, which I have enjoyed in your company.
Now, this letter was copied out by Martha and put in an envelope with a letter from her to Sally Fairfax. So it wasn't a secret communication, but something very poignant about that.
George Washington, with no natural children of his own, yet still the father of a country, died of a cold at 67 years of age. With a war and a constitution behind them, what would become of the other founding fathers? How do you follow the act of creating a new nation?
There is no individual achievement for any individual founding father. This was all a cooperative venture, and the cooperative venture involved the wives who supported them throughout, the slaves, north and south. It is an enormous cooperative achievement.
In their waning years, all the founding fathers knew they had been part of something momentous. Former Boston radical John Hancock held the office of Governor of Massachusetts for a total of 11 years. He must have forgiven George Washington for beating him out of the job of Commander-in-Chief, since he and his wife Dolly named their son John George Washington Hancock. Hancock's funeral in 1793 was the largest ever to take place in the new country. Samuel Adams began to march in his old friend's long burial procession, but couldn't finish because of ill health. The master propagandist, who some have said started the revolution, ended his life with his radical days well behind him.
Adams actually disappeared into the establishment. He was elected to the Massachusetts House of Representatives, and his thing was starting revolutions. That was his major function. After the revolution, he had nothing else to do.
Samuel Adams, the original Son of Liberty, died in 1803 at 81. Adams was just one of the founding fathers to live well beyond the life expectancy of the times. In 1789, a chronically ill Benjamin Franklin wrote a heartfelt letter to then-President George Washington.
For my own personal ease, I should have died 2 years ago. But though those years have been spent in excruciating pain, I am pleased I have lived them, since they have brought me to see our present situation.
He is an old man, and when people express the hope that he'll recover, he responds very plainly, I hope not. He's done it all, and it's time to go. He isn't worried. Nice way to end your life.
When he died in 1790 at the age of 84, all Philadelphia mourned. The city of brotherly love had lost its dearest friend. Towards the end of his life, another founding father, Thomas Paine, found himself with few friends left.
Paine claimed that he almost alone was responsible for American independence. That did not endear himself to people like John Adams.
Hungry for more revolution, Thomas Paine headed for France. He was arrested for opposing the Reign of Terror and thrown into prison.
Once he did escape from the French Revolution and came back to the United States, he made more enemies.
Mr. Washington, and as to you, sir, treacherous in private friendship and a hypocrite in public life, the world will be puzzled to decide whether you have abandoned good principles or whether you ever had any.
Tom Paine's problem was that he had the audacity to criticize Washington, to be so critical of Washington. It was like criticizing God himself.
In old age, he was a peculiarly unpleasant individual. Various people who were appreciative of his services took charge of him, but it was a thankless task.
When Thomas Paine died in 1809, even the Quakers refused him a burial. As his own death approached, Patrick Henry, too, found his popularity waning, primarily due to his opposition to the Constitution. Ironically, it was Henry's passionate tirades about the lack of an American Bill of Rights that actually helped force the bill into existence.
Liberty, the greatest of all earthly blessings. Give that precious jewel, and you may take everything else.
I think that in many ways that may be his greatest contribution to American history and to the history of our country, that his relentless drive to have a Bill of Rights demanded, because of his political power at that time, that they had to develop one.
Boy genius Alexander Hamilton had his own great contribution to make.
If the country's finances had not been put in order, we would have been chaotic, poor, divided, in debt, like many nations in the Third World today, and therefore the prey of more powerful countries. The main reason that didn't happen was because Alexander Hamilton became the first Treasury Secretary and got us out of our debt hole.
Hamilton apparently had time for activities other than the running of the nation's finances.
Hamilton had the first sex scandal in American politics.
Publicly accused of what amounted to insider trading by a man named James Reynolds, Hamilton admitted giving Reynolds money, but only because he'd had an affair with Reynolds' wife, and the couple was blackmailing him.
And in order to prove that he'd been an honest public servant, Hamilton wrote an account in the newspapers of the adultery and the blackmail and printed 20 love and blackmail letters he'd gotten from the Reynoldses. It's the most astonishingly honest confession by any American politician in a similar situation.
I have paid pretty severely for the folly, and can never recollect it without disgust and self-condemnation.
All his life, Hamilton's extreme opinions and arrogant demeanor continued to earn him powerful enemies. In 1804, then Vice President Aaron Burr challenged him to a duel. Burr shot Hamilton dead before his 50th birthday. Hamilton's one-time constitutional ally, James Madison, went on to help author the very Bill of Rights he had originally opposed. In 1809, the 58-year-old Madison was elected the 4th President of the United States, succeeding his mentor, Thomas Jefferson, who was elected 3rd President in 1800. Jefferson's daughter Patsy played the role of First Lady. In 1809, a reporter broke the rumored story of his liaison with Sally Hemings. Jefferson never responded to the accusation. Though his presidency and latter years were extraordinarily productive, Jefferson continued to live beyond his means.
Jefferson stays in debt throughout his entire life and dies the rough equivalent of about $10 million in debt. It's very sad.
Jefferson's former comrade, John Adams, succeeded Washington in the presidency, forever relegated to history as number 2.
Now, whoever follows Washington is in for deep trouble because no one can really replace him. And that's, in some sense, the story of the Adams presidency.
Before becoming president, John Adams was Washington's vice president, a post he described as
the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived.
To the end of his days, Adams remained bitter over what he considered public dismissal of his own importance in the Revolution.
Mausoleums, monuments, statues will never be erected to me. Panegyrical romances will never be written, nor flattering orations spoken to transmit me to posterity in brilliant colors. The whole history of this revolution will be a lie from beginning to end.
In one of the most remarkable coincidences in history, Jefferson and Adams both died on July 4th, 1826, exactly 50 years to the day after the passage of the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson spoke his last words on the evening of July 3rd.
Is it the 4th?
Unaware that his old friend was also dying, John Adams whispered his own last words,
Thomas Jefferson survives.
In fact, all the Founding Fathers survive. They live in the very soul of America. They are in every ballot box and every protest march, in every civil controversy and every political compromise. We are the rightful heirs of their great vision, their grand experiment, their abundantly human strengths and failings.
They're safely on Mount Rushmore and in the tidal basin, and we can afford to get to know them as they really were. And in the end, from my point of view, it is their fallibilities that make them not just more interesting, but in the end, helps explain why they succeeded.
We were very lucky. We had a collection not only of genius and talent, but also of a disposition to use it for the public good and not to use it for the good of the men themselves. They did what they had to do and what they thought was right, and then they set up a system whereby the people would ultimately choose their leaders, and leaders would come and go, but the system would remain.
The advice nearest to my heart and deepest in my convictions is that the union of the states be cherished and perpetuated.
We are not what we should be. We should labor for the future rather than the present moment.
I hope future ages will quote our proceedings with applause.
When we have lived our generation out, we should not wish to encroach on another. I like the dreams of the future better than the history of the past. So, good night. I will dream on.